Oh, we might be on. Well, let's start. Thank you for coming, everyone. It's great to have all of you here. I think we even have a live stream audience, so if you're joining us via live stream, we can see you. Thank you for joining. The point of tonight, and we were sort of just talking a little bit ahead of time and admitting that at least I'm feeling a little bit nervous because conversations on race can be uncomfortable, they can be difficult, and because they can be uncomfortable, because they can be difficult, they perhaps sometimes do make us nervous. And because they make us nervous, what happens is that too often we just avoid the conversation. We steer clear of the conversation. Perhaps what happens is we wait until there's an incident, we wait until there's some act of injustice, and then we're having the conversation, but we're having it in reaction to something that's happened. And in that case, it's a more charged conversation than it might need to be, or it's just not as productive as a conversation because we haven't taken the time to really understand each other, to really get to know each other. And so the point of tonight is to have a conversation. This evening is one dot. It's one data point in the course of a long-lived conversation going on at Hope. In fact, tonight is the first of two events that I will personally be involved with this semester. Later on in the semester, in November, we have Esau McCauley coming to campus, and I'm really excited about that. If you haven't read his book, it's called Reading While Black. It's amazing. You should check it out. He's coming in November. He's a professor at Wheaton, a great theologian. He's coming to talk about race and Christianity. And he also has a regular column in the New York Times that's worth reading. The point of tonight, as I said, is it's about having a conversation. But I actually think maybe the more important thing to note is that it's about modeling a conversation. And I guess I would just start by, before we jumping in, my role is simply to play moderator, to play referee between two gentlemen who are friends, two gentlemen who are scholars, two gentlemen who have thought deeply about issues of race and racial justice, and are both quite passionate about issues of race and racial justice. But they're coming from dramatically different lived experiences, and therefore they have different perspectives. And so in addition to listening to what they say, and they're going to say some things that are worth listening to, I promise you that, I actually think more important than listening to what they're going to say is observing how they're talking, observing how they're disagreeing, and then observe how they will shake hands at the end of the conversation. Will you guys shake hands? We can at least do a fist bump, at least a COVID fist bump.
We've practiced.
Wait and see.
Wait and see. But before we jump in, I just want to make three important caveats at the start of the conversation. The first important caveat is simply that the point of tonight is not to try and present a holistic view of all perspectives on race. Every question that we'll talk about tonight has a myriad of perspectives. And if our point was to try to represent all perspectives, we would have put a large panel together. And that's not what we're trying to do tonight. Rather, what we're trying to do tonight is simply to model a conversation. So we have two perspectives, that's it. It's not a presentation of all perspectives, it's two perspectives. And I don't know about you, but I think most significant conversations that I have usually are one-on-one. And so you can think of this as, maybe it's you and your roommate, or maybe it's you and a good friend. It's just modeling how a one-on-one conversation can happen. So that's the first caveat, is that the point of tonight is not to try to represent all perspectives. It's simply to model a conversation between two interesting people who have different perspectives. The second caveat I want to make is that this evening should not be confused with action. Some people have said things to me like, well, isn't it time that we start doing something? Isn't it time that we start doing something instead of just talking about race? Shouldn't we start doing something? I agree with that sentiment. It is time that we start doing things. And the good news is, at Hope, we're doing a lot. We have a lot going on already to foster a climate of racial justice on this campus and to make sure that this campus is one in which everyone feels like they belong here. The point of tonight is not to give a presentation on all the things that we're doing at Hope. Again, the point of tonight is to model a conversation. So first caveat is that this is not a presentation on all perspectives. Second point is that this is not a presentation on all things happening at Hope. The third caveat, and this will sound a little bit like I'm contradicting my second caveat, but I promise you I'm not. The third caveat is that don't think that because we're just talking tonight that we're not doing something. Having a healthy conversation, having a healthy, difficult conversation is doing something. Because having conversation in a healthy way is part of what we need to be doing. And in fact, I might argue that it's one of the more important things that we need to be doing, is modeling how to have important, healthy, but difficult conversations. And it's remarkable how countercultural that is today, because our world is just set up for it's not set up for listening, it's set up for shouting at each other. Like, look at cable news, look at social media. It's people shouting at each other. And the problem is we've replaced the art of conversation with clicks and comments. And we have to get past it. We have to change it. And I actually think an academic environment is the perfect place to model a conversation. Over the summer, somebody said to me, they said, Matt, why is it that you people in academia think that colleges and universities can solve all the world's problems? And maybe we can, maybe we can't, but I think the interesting thing is, because we have a community here, we can at least represent a microcosm of, we can try to represent a microcosm of how the world should be. And one thing that the world is desperately lacking today is good conversation, healthy conversation, but difficult conversation. By the way, it doesn't mean that we don't get animated in healthy conversations. We might see some of that tonight. It doesn't mean that we don't get angry sometimes in healthy conversations. There's a lot in our world, by the way, that's worth being angry about. It's good to be angry. There's a verse in Philippians that says, be angry, but in your anger, do not sin. So we have to be careful about our anger, but it's okay to be angry, and I actually think apathy is much more dangerous than anger. The point of tonight is just to model what a good conversation can look like. So I think that's all the framing I want or need to do. Let's jump in. And maybe just as a starting point, why don't each of you just introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background, perhaps share a little bit of your lived experiences, and then talk about why race is of particular importance for you. Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Sure thing. So I'm Kevin Kambo. I've been at Hope for about 3 years now. Began my 4th year. I teach in the philosophy department, mainly. And I'm from Kenya. And so my experiences and my perspectives on these are sort of colored by that, though of course I am not here to give you the Kenyan perspective. But what is interesting is Kenya is a country that doesn't have many black people because we don't grow up thinking of ourselves as black. When I first sort of had to face this question in a kind of real personal way was when I was applying to college, coming to the States for undergrad. And there's one of these little forms where you're supposed to kind of explain, well, tell the machine, are you black / African American, white / Caucasian, et cetera, And it was interesting because both myself and my cousin who'd sort of gone ahead of me, both sort of paused at that moment because we thought, well, is black the same as African American? Not sure. And both of us, without one telling the other, both checked other and put in our tribal name. Because that's why we thought, oh, that's how I've grown up. I've grown up Kikuyu, I speak Kikuyu. The Kikuyu words for, someone of European descent is not white. So this was just a new category, and it's only when I came to the United States I realized, oh, guess what, I am black. And people started inviting me to the black parties. People said, let's go hang out at the Black Dorm, which had a Swahili name that was mispronounced, which was amusing to the East Africans. And so stuff like that of how am I navigating this sort of new, interesting thing that is not how I've grown up, but in funny ways would sort of come across my experience of I'm being treated in a way that is different or interesting, and why does this happen? So like for a small example is, I've been an undergrad in the States, in grad school, and now I'm teaching at Hope. And no shame to Hope College, but at every school I've been to, my photographs tends to show up on a poster or a magazine cover, and it's not because of my personality, I don't think, or my wit, or my accent, or anything like that, but you just feel that something about me matters to people in a sort of interesting kind of way, and I often don't have ownership of this. And so that's something that happens, continually, and then over the last couple of years, I've also just seen, especially living in Holland, feeling that sort of tensions about these questions have sort of risen in interesting ways. And both for African Americans and white people and Kenyans and Africans in general. And so just as I've been navigating this, I've been thinking, well, what is this race thing after all? And what do I think about it? This is not usually how I think of myself, but it's clearly how people see me. And so it's very much a kind of Du Bois sort of moment where he talks about black people inhabiting a kind of dual consciousness. On the one hand, you know yourself however else you are, but you have this feeling of there's this other thing of how people approach me, deal with me, think about me, that you don't have really much control over, which in a way happens for everyone, but in the United States, the race one is kind of has a sort of weight to it. So I just started reading and thinking about this over the last couple of years, and I mainly teach in ancient philosophy, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about will actually come from that lens. Race is not something I do a lot of research on personally, though I have a couple of articles on my mind. But I'll be looking at it as sort of a student of the ancient world and a kind of prisoner of the modern world, or pilgrim through the modern world, and trying to figure out what is happening to me, what do I think about this, and what is it doing to all of us. Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thanks, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Jantzen. I'm the director of the Emmaus Scholars Program here at Hope College. It's one of, I think we have 3 living learning communities on campus. I'm also a faculty member in the Center for Ministry Studies. I teach broadly in the area of religion and race, Christian theologian by training. The story of how I got to be on this stage talking about this topic tonight is a long one, and so I will tell it in a very abbreviated form. My high school and college experiences roughly mapped onto the first decade of the 21st century, which means that the formative years in which I was learning who I was as an adult, how I thought about a complex world, were marked by the War on Terror, by torture, Guantanamo Bay, cruise missiles and drone strikes killing civilians, escalating crises of contemporary capitalism, which left my entire graduating class from college staring into an economic abyss when we walked down and received our diplomas. And in the context of that, I moved to Durham, North Carolina to go to seminary at Duke Divinity School. And then a lot of things started happening very quickly. The Citizens United Supreme Court decision came down and allowed dark money to flood into elections across the United States. And propelled by a backlash against the first black president and dark money infusions, right-wing politicians took control of the North Carolina General Assembly for the first time in almost 100 years. Republicans, I should say, not necessarily right-wing. And they quickly proceeded to do a number of things, the very first of which was redistricting. So 2010 is a census year, and voting districts were redrawn in North Carolina, and they were gerrymandered so painfully and so extremely that in the next election, the Republican Party won a supermajority in both houses of the North Carolina General Assembly and the governor's office, despite only representing a small majority of voters in the state of North Carolina. And they proceeded to enact a string of legislation that hurt black, brown, and low-income people of all races and ethnicities in the state of North Carolina, and I had a front row seat for it. Repealing the Racial Justice Act, which had allowed inmates on death row to appeal their execution if they could prove that racial bias had been a factor in their sentencing. Denying unemployment benefits for 70,000 North Carolinians. Refusing the expansion of health insurance, which would have provided insurance for 500,000 North Carolinians. And finally, enacting one of the nation's first in this sort of era monster voter suppression bills, which targeted African American voters with surgical precision, according to the court ruling, which would be handed down years later after it was too late to do anything. And I watched that, and I felt like it was a strange world. I grew up in Vermont. Vermont is the second whitest state in the United States, followed closely by Maine, and I spent a lot of time in Maine too. And so moving to the South, being encountered by these ongoing developments at the state level, and then living in a city which was a dark blue city in a deep red state, and yet was a city where tidal waves of gentrification were sweeping through historic African American communities that had been in Durham since the Civil War, where people were getting displaced, where neighbors were disappearing and people didn't even know where they were going. And developers were coming in, pressuring people to sell their home, flipping it, making a huge amount of money, and sticking a nice young white family like me and my family into it. And those families who moved from all over to go to Duke University, to access Research Triangle Park, didn't even know the neighborhoods that they were pilfering. And I watched all this happening, and had a lot of questions, to say the least. But I also found some people who were giving answers. The Reverend William J. Barber II, who's then president of the North Carolina NAACP and is now the leader with Liz Theoharis of the Poor People's Campaign, was putting together a coalition of people who were invested in multiracial democracy in the state of North Carolina. And I found myself marching with them in Raleigh around the state capitol. I found myself swept up in broad-based community organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation, with a group called Durham CAN, Congregations, Associations, and Neighborhoods. And we led campaigns around gentrification and displacement and affordable housing, around the securitization of immigrant communities, and the handing over of people to ICE who didn't need to be handed over. And my life was transformed. And at the same time, I found myself at Duke University, a place which was at that time one of the best places in the world, I think, to think about what Christian faith has to do with race and whiteness and the racial world that we inhabit. And so I sat in that stew for several years, completed seminary, did a doctorate at Duke, and then came to Hope College. And so here I am trying to figure out how to take my experiences in North Carolina, in graduate school, in social movements and broad-based community organizing, and bring it into the classroom and into the community that is Hope College. So thank you all for coming tonight. It's the second week of classes. Many of you are very busy, probably very stressed. So thank you for entrusting us with this time to have this conversation.
Matt, you should give your book a shout out. Mention your
Sure.
new book.
Well, since you mentioned it, Matt, I do have my first book out this past February with Lexington Books. It's called God, Race, and History, Liberating Providence. It is sinfully expensive. This is one of the ramifications of being an early career scholar in the sort of contemporary publishing landscape. But perhaps you could get it from a library or interlibrary loan it if you want to take a look at it. And you can also find some of my writings if you just Google me on the internet, some articles, a podcast interview. So now I'm plugging more than just the book. You opened the door and I'm going to take it. So
what I want to do is just sort of whet the appetite for a conversation by asking 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. Why don't we start at the very beginning? Let's go back to a really basic question. And I think since obviously Hope is a predominantly white community, I don't know about most people. When I was a student here, I didn't think about my whiteness. I didn't think about whiteness as a race. And I remember when I was newly living in New York City, so this was probably 12-ish years ago, we went to a very mixed-race church, and a good friend came up to me. He's a black Christian, and he said, you know what? He said to me, what really annoys me about white Christians is that you don't see that there's white culture. You see that there's black culture, you see that there's Asian cultures, you see that there's Latino cultures, but you think your culture is just the default. And then he said something really startling to me. He said, that's racist. That's racist to just think that your culture is the default culture. So I'd love to just start with both of you at the very beginning. A simple question, what is racism? And maybe a leading question into that is, what is race at the very beginning? Kevin, let's start with you again.
Yeah, sure thing. Philosophers allegedly like definitions, and we're supposed to do this all the time. I will confess that what I'm going to give you is a standing definition. It's the best one I have today. I've been doing a sort of soft poll among some people because the more I thought about this, the more complicated I realized defining something like this actually turned out to be. When people talk about racism, I think there's sort of maybe 3 major kind of focal points. Usually they maybe talk about someone's psychology, right? So your prejudices or your animus or something like that. So, your heart, your feelings, your beliefs, things like that. Okay. And then maybe all people might talk about actions, so the things that you actually do. And then thirdly, there's outcomes. And in the way people talk, or the way people go through these days, that's more or less they'll focus in on one of those things and say, that's how I'm going to go with this definition of racism. And so, for example, someone like Ibram Kendi is going to say, well, racism is about outcomes. It doesn't matter, at a certain level, it doesn't really matter what your beliefs and feelings are. It doesn't really matter almost what you're really doing unless it's acting against unjust racial outcomes, so racial inequity, right? So as long as you have something producing racial inequity, that's racist. And that's his definition. And the more I thought about that, I thought, well, that's kind of complicated because a lot of people think, for example, the United States is racist. At least the political system is racist, but the political system nevertheless produced a black president. That doesn't look like a racist outcome necessarily, but maybe it is racist. So outcomes might not work, and the outcomes are also complicated. So people will talk about redlining and the effects that has had, loans that discrimination that leads to loans and things like this. But then there are other sort of racial inequities that are complicated. So look at the NBA. It's clearly racially unequal. I don't think the NBA is sort of, look at the NBA and I think racist. But I think the same people will look at the NHL and they'd say, well, it's clearly super white. So maybe the NHL is racist. We're like, well, that doesn't seem consistent. Or let's think of health things. Okay, so black people maybe suffer disproportionately in the health system, so that's clearly racist. But then you look at particular things, it becomes, again, a lot more complicated because you look at the abortion rate between black people and white people. The abortion rate for the last about 3 decades or so, the abortion rate for black people has been 4 to 5 times that of white people. Is that racist? I'm not sure, because I assume a lot of the people would say, well, it might be an effect of it, but it's not actually racist to support Planned Parenthood. I mean, they would say they do good things, even though they're the ones performing all these abortions. So the outcome thing never quite made sense to me, because outcomes are complicated, they have many causes. Anyone who knows social science should know that. That's why you try and correct for variables. That's why you do regressions. A monocausal world just doesn't work. So outcomes was never really going to be satisfying. On the opposite end, we have thoughts, feelings, desires, things like that, which is sort of the thing that gets focused, especially when you watch TV, right? So you've got the guy spitting at Jackie Robinson, or you've got the mean old white racist dude, and we think, oh yeah, that's really what racism looks like. But that seems to erase a lot of the things we really care about, right? A lot of the real injustices, people being killed, people being displaced, people being harmed in various ways. So I think that action, and I mean, I'm a moral philosopher, so action is probably the right kind of locus for finding out, okay, what is racism? And my definition is something along the lines of, it's going to be application of a social or civic or legal double standard, motivated by judging people by ancestry and saying that their worth is determined by what race they belong to, okay? Which then leads to the question of, well, what is race? And this one is more interesting to me because when I think about race, the categories I have is, it looks like something that is more ancient than modern, okay? So by way of example, those of you who've read Plato's Republic, there's an interesting bit where early on, Socrates is trying to found a new city. And he says, well, the thing that you need to convince the people to do is to believe that there are gold souls and silver souls and bronze souls, and we're going to stratify society this way, and it'll be organized, and they will have different social classes, the different things that they can own, different capacities for leadership and political governance, and that's how we're going to order society. And he knows this is false, because this is a myth that is given to the people as a way of organizing the society. And so they attempt this, and things seem to be going on well, and this happens relatively early in the Republic. But then later on, when the eugenicists are trying to make sure that the gold-souled people only mate with the gold-souled people, and you keep the classes pure, they fail. The society falls apart. And when scholars sort of look at this, they always say, well, it is puzzling. I mean, I guess it's hard to do sums and maintain clear, useful eugenics for a big city, but I think the Platonic point is actually much simpler, that if you build a society on a lie, it is unsustainable. And that's what I think race essentially is. It's sort of like a founding or fratricidal lie. And the sort of North African theologian Augustine of Hippo, he says, human societies, especially human cities, tend to be founded in this way. So he looks at Cain killing Abel in the city of God, and he says, this is how Cain goes and becomes the first founder of a human city by killing his brother. And then he says, and this is how Rome is founded. Rome is founded by, you have these two twins, Remus and Romulus, and Romulus, and it is a fratricidal killing that leads to the founding of the city. That this is a pattern throughout history, that we attack our brother, and on his bones, so to speak, we build a new city. And in many ways, the modern world is built on this lie. And so for me, this is what it is. Race is a lie. It is a dangerous lie. It is one that continues to affect us and continues to sort of get into our heads in funny ways. But if we were to sort of flip this into a more theological kind of category, I think I would go farther and say, ultimately, race is an idol. It is something that is man-made. It has a weird sort of resemblance to things in the natural world, which is what idols are, right? In Scripture, we are told they have eyes but do not see, they have mouths but do not speak, they have ears but do not hear. This is both what they are, but it's also, I think, what they do. So race blinds us, right? It makes us look at people in funny ways, and this has happened historically. We can see this, right? African Americans, black people have been harmed by this continually. But it also continues to harm us in funny ways these days. I mean, I've been reading articles of, some poor Latino guy who was tricked into giving the OK symbol, and turns out this is the white power symbol, and no one seemed to care, right, that he was innocent, and he had to go down because these are the categories in our minds. It makes us deaf, right? We don't listen to people suffering, because it's a way of sort of pushing people away. And again, right, think of the Tuskegee trials and things like that. Think of the suffering of African Americans. This kind of thing happens all the time. This is what race does to us. It makes us deaf to other people's suffering. But it also makes us dumb, and maybe in two ways. It both keeps us from speaking up when bad things are happening, but it also makes us say dumb things. So last summer, for example, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., was trying to articulate white culture versus black culture. And tracking down white culture is very hard work. And so they put out a little chart, which is a nice little handout. And it had things like, well, white culture is eating bland food, and it is being, believing in the meritocracy, it is being future-oriented, it is believing in the written word, it's being self-sufficient. I mean, if you remove the bland food stuff, in some ways you can make someone like Kobe Bryant one of the whitest men on the planet. This is a guy who believes in self-sufficiency and future-orientedness more than most humans on the planet, right? So this is the kind of thing race does to us. It makes us blind, it makes us deaf, it makes us dumb. And it continues to do this continually, okay? One interesting example with regard to, say, COVID, another one that sort of struck me, was reading an article in the New York Times about academics responding to the fact that African Americans are disproportionately affected by health issues generally in the United States, and so this should affect how we distribute vaccines. And you had a couple of public health scientists from what we call R1 university, top tier, and their recommendations were really fascinating to me because one of them went and said, well, we should, first responders and frontline, yeah, that makes sense, but we shouldn't privilege old people because there's a lot of white people among the old people. And so we should move the old people down the list, even if it means we're going to have to lose some black old people, but we'll lose more white old people. I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then someone else also, same article said, similar vein, went and explained, yeah, you know what? A lot of white people end up being teachers. They go to school, they've got all these bleeding heart sympathies, they go and teach. We should move teachers down also, because that'll mean we'll probably lose more white people, and this will give us more equity. And this is what idols do, because ultimately idols demand human sacrifice. And that is what race has done historically in the past, and is what race will continue to do today, as long as we allow this thing to be the categories that dominate our thoughts, dominate our actions, dominate the way we treat each other. And so, yeah, what is racism? It is application of an unjust double standard based on ancestry, but it's based on a lie, a fratricidal lie. It's based on an idol. And that's sort of, yeah, my quick searing hot take on what this is.
Race is a lie. Race is an idol. I would agree, and I think it's important that we name specifically what kind of a lie it is, what kind of an idol it is. Where does race come from? One of the problems we have in a lot of public discourse about race in our society today is that we spend very little time thinking very carefully about the roots and the origins of race. We too quickly naturalize and neutralize race and turn it into a sanitary demographic title. And it's no such thing. If you've ever been in a class where there's a professor has talked about race, one of the first things they've probably said is, race is a, can anyone fill in the blank? Social construct. Thank you. I thought it might be ubiquitous enough that I could leave it and you would fill it in. That's true. But what does that mean? Social construct sounds benign. It's heavily sanitized. It sounds like it was produced in a laboratory where social scientists were working. This is not where race was produced. Race was produced by people who had come to understand themselves as white, as a way of structuring their distorted vision of the world and justifying their claims to rule it. There was when race was not, to borrow an old phrase by an old heretic named Arius. That one's for you, Jared. Human societies have always found ways to make distinctions between each other. There has always been attempts at constructing hierarchies. But race is a very particular instance of that. It's not simply one more generic chapter. And it goes back to the 15th century, when people who lived in what they would come to call Europe, who would come to think of themselves as white, gained extraordinary power to travel the globe. And overnight, the world was transformed. One of my mentors, Willie Jennings, describes this period of history as akin to a science fiction novel. So strange and foreign to our experiences of the world was this period in time. Think about to be living in that time. Overnight, the world is strange. The world is many times larger than you ever imagined it to be. The world is filled with people and animals and landscapes that you have never in your wildest dreams fathomed the existence of. And European Christians found themselves again in the position to write the script of what would happen next. It was a world fraught with possibilities. It could have gone many ways. The unfortunate truth is that it went in a very distorted and very destructive way. As Christians in what would become Europe drew upon distorted visions of creation and election to remake a world in their own image. And so race is idolatry because whiteness is idolatry. Because instead of worshiping God as the creator and everything else as creature, those who had come to think of themselves as white made themselves the creators of the world and structured a vision of what it meant to be human, of what it meant to be a person in their own image. This is where race comes from. It was forged through conquest, through sexual violence, around visions of masculinity, through the destruction of lands, through the mass extinction of peoples and their cultures. And the last thing I will say is that race is a Christian invention. Race is anti-Christian. It's not non-Christian, it is anti-Christian, in that it is a counterfeit of Christianity. It grows out of a distorted Christian theological vision of the world, not only of creation, but of election, of seeing what it meant to be Christian as blending with what it meant to be European, as blending with what it meant to be white, and then having almost omnipotent power to try to craft a vision of the world and its peoples calibrated to that image. And so it is fundamentally also a rejection of the election of Israel, and it is a rejection of the doctrine of the incarnation, which says that the Jewish human being, Jesus of Nazareth, reveals what it means to both to be God and to be human. The project of race, which was fundamentally the project of whiteness, was about displacing Jesus and saying that white European humanity showed what it meant to be human, showed what it meant to sit atop the world, showed what it meant to be the ruler of the world and the ruler of creation. So when we talk about racism, we are talking about something so much broader than individual acts, than a microaggression, even broader than the deepest, most systemic, entrenched facets of racial inequality in our world. We are talking about a fundamental way of seeing and being in the world that grows out of poisoned Christian soil. We need one of those chess clocks. So I'll pause there.
Let's stay on that point, and Matt, I want to stay with you for a second.
Sure.
Let me ask the counter, the mirror opposite of the question. So we said, what is racism? What is anti-racism?
Yeah. Not an easy question to answer. From my perspective, anti-racism is profoundly in flux. There was a time not many years ago when I was invested in something called anti-racist politics, and it would not generate a lot of positive reactions from people. There were not a lot of people who were gung-ho about anti-racism, and that has shifted. Now, in part, I think that shift has been for the good. We have seen people turning out for racial justice, especially white people, in ways unprecedented in recent history. There are many people, some maybe of you who are here tonight or watching the stream, who are worried that the ubiquity of anti-racism in our society today is a sign that the most nefarious, radical politics have infiltrated our country and subverted our values. I kind of wish that they were right, but I'm not sure they are. Because what I also see is the content of what it means to be anti-racist shifting too. And I see a version of anti-racism, and maybe I'll start here and then work my way back to the other side of the coin. There is a version of anti-racism which is performative, which is superficial, which is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's not linked to deep-seated personal transformation. It doesn't require that you risk anything. And mostly it's just about how you are perceived. There's a personal version of this. Many of us maybe struggle with how we do this, how we use our Twitter or Instagram. Do we tweet the right things? I don't really know social media. I can't even pretend. Whatever you do with Instagram to show that you're paying attention on Instagram, right? And there's a question as to whether how much of this is just identity curation, a kind of social justice accessorizing, right? a bumper sticker anti-racism that doesn't lead to any change and is mostly just about making you feel better about yourself and showing the world how woke you are. And there's also an institutional version of this, right? This is one-time corporate consultant HR-based diversity trainings that change nothing about the mission and structure of an organization. This is running a diversity program while you run an oil refinery that pumps toxins into African American neighborhoods in Detroit and calling yourself anti-racist. I hope that's not what anti-racism is. But I've also seen a side to anti-racism that is about deep-seated personal transformation. To use theological language and some language I've used in some writing I've done, is about conversion, both personal and structural. A fundamental turning from death to life that costs you everything. But like the man in Matthew who finds treasure in a field and goes and sells everything he has in joy because he knows that in that field there is treasure, leads to truth, to justice, to community, the likes of which many of us never would otherwise get to experience, living within the strictures of a society steeped in whiteness. When I think about anti-racism, I think about people like Ella Baker. I think about people like Septima Clark, like Fannie Lou Hamer. People who had a conviction that ordinary people working together across lines that divide, whether it's class or race or gender or sexual orientation, could build a new world, could transform our society in revolutionary ways, and that revolution would not just be political and social and economic, but would also be personal. Perhaps no one articulated this better for me than Grace Lee Boggs, who spent the better part of her life in Detroit with her husband Jimmy Boggs. And if you haven't been to the Boggs Center or haven't read the Boggs' writings, I would encourage you to do so. And the Boggs understood that as fundamental a change as political and social revolution would be in the service of anti-racism, it could not succeed without personal and cultural revolution too. A recovery of a new way to be human beyond the strictures of whiteness. For me, that's what anti-racism is about. Figuring out ways of life beyond whiteness. Because whiteness is death. But as Christians, we know what to do with death. And we know that in Jesus we are freed from death, and that there are new possibilities for being human, new ways of living and being in the world, in a new community that are open to us, not because of anything we can do to deserve it, not because of anything we can do to earn it, and yet, paradoxically and simultaneously, graciously made possible through Jesus Christ and the presence of the Spirit with us today. Again, there's never going to be a good place to stop with a conversation like this. So I will restrain myself, and we'll go to Kevin, I
Kevin,
guess.
jump in here. Same question, but I'd love to specifically say, what about what Matt said do you disagree with?
Oh. All of it. Kidding. Yeah.
I agree that it's an idol and that it's a lie, right? At least in its inception.
Well, one thing that's interesting to me, and I'm going to actually go to something in the previous question, if that's okay.
Sure.
There's an interesting problem for me, just as far as psychology is concerned, is the causal relationship between race and racism. So the way Matt just told the story, the Europeans woke up, found out they were white, and decided to go and make the world black. And but then that didn't quite explain how did they become white. And I think psychologically it actually would make more sense is they were oppressing people, and they had to come up with a rationalization to justify that oppression. And so it's not that race produces racism, but sort of the reverse, that racism produces race. And think about Africans who arrive in Virginia in the 17th century. They do not arrive as black. And they are not the only people in, they might be slaves, but there are white indentured servants who are essentially chattel property, right? They can be bet for at poker games. They can be tortured. So initially, actually, the people in the colonies are not keen on taking up African labor because they think they're going to get new diseases that they're not used to. They're going to die soon. It doesn't make sense as an economic investment. It's only once you actually have enough black people to oppress that they move from being slaves to becoming black. And you can have a system that can maintain this. And then you can free the indentured white servants and make them white people. And so psychologically is, how do people become white? How do people become black? And it's a question you should ask yourself. Who made you white? Who made you black? And why? And why do you want to remain that way? Why do you want to remain in the sort of plantation categories? Why can't you imagine yourself as other than within this corrupt and atrocious system, right? So race, yes, is a monstrous lie. It's a monstrous fiction. And racism is a monstrous crime. But they kind of go together, but kind of getting a handle on which one is the one that causes the other, right? It's sort of interesting to me. With regard to anti-racism, I totally agree with Matt. It's just kind of all over the place, depending on whom you read. So generally, there's the vibe that, to be anti-racist is to be against racism. Oh yeah, okay, great. I suppose that probably counts everyone in the room. But then you ask, okay, but actually, how do we go about this? And that becomes much more complicated. So if we go back to those three categories, right? So there's an issue about psychology, there's an issue about action, there's an issue about outcomes. Some people's approach to anti-racism is purely about the outcomes. But something like that just draws with it all the weaknesses of sort of consequentialist philosophy. What counts as too much to bring out the right outcome, that never really gets discussed. Okay, and so just because you have a good outcome in mind, it doesn't mean the things you're going to do to bring about it are actually going to be good things. On the other side, right, you're the sort of heavy psychology people, and I think so Roby and D'Angelo is sort of in this sense of, it is a puzzle to me why we are focused in on whiteness and we're having a white woman tell us about whiteness when we could instead be talking about racism. And how are the actual ways in which people are being discriminated against, being harmed, but instead it sort of retreats about, oh, you're so white, and you should feel bad, and if you don't feel bad, you're fragile. I'm like, okay, but how is that really actually helping people? That's a harder question, and one that never really gets asked. There's obviously the position of people of color, which is its own sort of funny category, in this whole thing, right? So in sort of D'Angelo world, it's about what can the white people do, more or less. And I don't know if you guys play RPGs, but I sometimes feel like POCs are like NPCs. We're non-playable characters. We're just there to give the white people quests. And go and do this, and go and do this, and go and do this. And it's like, well, what's your responsibility? What's your contribution? What's going on? And that's weird to me, okay? But that's sort of how you read white fragility, and that's kind of dirty sense that I got kind of coming out of it. But on the other hand, there's a fascinating young woman I think she's in New York. Her name is Chloe Valdry. And living the American dream, she markets herself as possessing the dopest anti-racism program in the United States. And her approach is to say, well, the thing to do here is, it's actually not aiming directly at outcomes or at whiteness, but it's about unity. And I think Matt and I probably agree about this. It's about how do you restore fractured relationships, how do you work across suspicion and things like this. And helping Americans realize that in a certain sense there is no such thing as white culture, and I agree with this, and there is no such thing as black culture too. Right? Kingston, Nairobi, London, these are very different sorts of black people. They don't actually share a culture. But the United States has African Americans, and that is American culture, a particular kind of American culture, Yes. But in LA and in Harlem and in Georgia, it's going to look slightly different. But this is the American story. It's not a story of white versus black. It's a story of freedom against oppression. And they've been whites and blacks on both sides the whole time. Like, they've been people on the Underground Railroad who were white. There's John Brown, who's a militant abolitionist who got killed, and he was white. And similar today, right? There's going to be people of, all races, but we all know now that that is a fake category, working to solve real problems of real people. And I think that's probably the main thing I would say, insofar as one were to try and have a healthier anti-racism, is fewer abstractions and more questions about concrete people and concrete communities, and asking what's actually needed here, and what can you do here and now, and things like that.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go to the audience. So while they're discussing, do you have note cards? Do people out there have note cards? No. Some people say yes, some people say no. Students will be distributing note cards. That can happen now. As you get your note card, if you have a question, write it on the note card, and then someone will collect the note cards. If you are a student, so we want to prioritize students. This is the intent of this was to be primarily for a student audience. So if you are a student, write "student" at the top of your question, and we'll put your question at the top of the stack. If you're not a student, you could write "student" at the top of your question, but that would be a lie. That would be a lie. So be careful. Be careful.
Lifelong learners do not count as students, FYI.
I want to compare and contrast this concept of anti-racism with what the Bible talks about in terms of racial reconciliation. And the way I read the Bible is there's this big story arc of racial reconciliation that starts in Genesis and goes all the way to Revelation. And in Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, we have people scattered because of sin. They're scattered by tribe, by nation, and by language. And then at the very end of the Bible, all tribes, all nations, all languages come back together around the throne of Christ. And so there's this big story arc of racial reconciliation that goes throughout the Bible. And it's talked about all throughout. And Jesus talks about race all throughout. And it's in their context, it's in this Jew-Gentile context. And in Ephesians 2, it says that one of the reasons Jesus came to earth was to break down the dividing walls of hostility between Jew-Gentile, between race. So how do you think about where do you see tension between the way the world talks about anti-racism and what the Bible talks about in terms of racial reconciliation, and where do you see congruence between anti-racism and what the Bible's talking about in terms of reconciliation? Matt, we'll go back to you.
I think it's a bit of a category mistake theologically to jump from a scriptural paradigm of reconciliation to talking about racial reconciliation. And so let me maybe explain why I think that. The story of reconciliation that we get in Scripture, as I understand it, is first and foremost the story of God reconciling God's people, which is Israel, to God's self in Jesus. At the end of that story, surprisingly and miraculously, it is discovered that the Gentiles are welcomed into that reconciliation too. And remember, this is no foregone conclusion. When the Spirit starts moving in Acts and pushing first Peter, right? And then others to go to the Gentiles, it's a surprise, and it's resisted. And the disciples say, and the early apostles say, no, you don't understand. That's not how this works. This covenant is between God and Israel. And it's only by the gracious and mysterious overflow of God's covenant love that the Gentiles are brought into the story of God and Israel. Now, whiteness, as I understand it, grows fundamentally out of a rejection of that story. If you are not a member of the people of Israel, whether you take that ethnically or theologically, you are a Gentile. And the story that we read in Scripture is not first and foremost your story. You are on the outside looking in. The story of the birth of race is how Gentiles refused that status as those who were outside but were brought near through the gracious love of God and said, no, 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 no. We are the ones that this story is about. This is our God. This is the root of the racial condition. This is the paradigm that Christian thinkers in crafting discourses of race in the early modern world drew upon. It was to say, we European Christians are the center of this story of what God is doing in the world. Jesus is our Savior. And that this meant a rejection of the Jews and of Jesus' Jewishness. And so to talk about reconciliation and to talk about whiteness are to talk about two things that are fundamentally and mutually exclusive of one another. Whiteness is predicated on a rejection of what it means to be Gentiles brought near and brought into a party that you were not invited to. And to say, no, this is our party and we will call the shots. And so once again, we face this obstacle, which is that whiteness is not just a demographic category, but is a profound problem, especially for those of us who have come to think of ourselves as white. And so God's work of reconciliation that we see in Scripture, of bringing Israel close and then graciously bringing the Gentiles in to God's covenant promise with Israel, can't coexist with a way of seeing the world that puts ourselves at the center of what God is doing in Scripture and says, this is our story and we control it. And so once again, to find the reconciliation that we see in Scripture, we will have to find a way past whiteness. And again, for some of us, that feels like we're screwed. And you are. But if you're a Christian, this should be old news to you. There is nothing you can do. And yet, mysteriously and graciously, in that moment of saying we are incapable of extricating ourselves from this situation, nevertheless, new ways of being human are made possible in Jesus, and you are invited into them despite having no claim of them for yourself. And this is the world that we inhabit, and this is the story that we struggle to remember, and this is the work that we have to do as Christians. To be Christian and anti-racist is to squarely look into the face that whiteness is a rejection of the story of God's reconciling work in Scripture, and to try to find a way to be something more than that. So that's maybe a little bit of a counterintuitive way to take this question. But if we think of racial reconciliation as simply one sort of transfer case of the deeper paradigm of reconciliation in Scripture, then we miss the crisis that whiteness poses for us. Maybe Kevin will see things differently.
Just a little differently. One of the things that I find sort of interesting about this discourse is that very many people talk about whiteness in very different ways, and it's hard to know who has a correct account of this. But what is clear is, especially in the 21st century, whiteness is not a good thing. Whatever account of it you have, it's never going to be positive. And one of the confusions I have regularly is whiteness a characteristic of white people? And no one really actually adequately ever answers that one. That last week, when I was trying to figure out who are the white people, I went to the US government Census Bureau page, and you should go and it's fascinating and hilarious. Who's white? And it said, well, it's the people of European descent. I was like, okay, fine. It's also Middle Eastern people, interesting. And it's also North Africans. It's like, oh, well, there you go, my friends from North Africa, my Egyptians, you're no longer black. Augustine, no longer black, I guess, according to the government. Who decides these things? More interesting was, who gets to be black? And on the census page, the answer was, if you're a member of one of the black racial groups of Africa. I was like, oh, that is the exact opposite of a definition. They do not know what makes you black. And in a sense, no one actually does. And if you believe in something as ridiculous as the one-drop rule, namely that if you are descended from someone who, let's say, descended from Africa and landed in the United States, who landed in the United States in the 17th century or something, turns out that about more than two-thirds, so follow me on this, more than two-thirds of the people who have an African ancestor in the United States, we call them white. So if you believe in the one-drop rule, okay, two-thirds of the black people are white people, all right? That's how crazy this category is. It shifts, it doesn't make sense, and the way we've centered it in our lives doesn't make sense to me. So if I were to try and approach it with sort of Christian categories, and I've already claimed, right, race is an idol. So in a way, whiteness is something that is always shifting. Its definition is never settled down. To me, race is the idol. Race is the problem. And in contrast to the idol is what we would call the icon, right? So the human being is the image of God. And so this is the contest between the idol and the icon in my mind. In Paul's letter to the Colossians, he says something like, second chapter, do not be seduced by empty philosophies, and that cut deeply for a philosophy professor, that are founded on the traditions of men and founded on the elemental powers. And I thought, that's exactly what race is. And then in Paul's letter to Ephesians, this should be chapter 6, he says, we are not contending against flesh and blood, we are contending against powers and principalities. And I think that's the fundamental truth here. We are not fighting people. And this is the thing you have to sort of pick up from a lot of, I think, the best sort of black writers in this tradition. Your opponent is not a person, or is not a human person at least. And once you can get that, I think then you ask yourself, in every interaction, are you approaching someone, looking at them as through the idol, right? So what does it mean in my treatment of this person if he's white? How should I treat him if he's black? How should I treat him if he's Latino? That's kind of crazy. Or maybe you say, well, I should look at him as an icon. I should treat, and that is way easier because everyone is an icon. Everyone is an image of God. And so you have a ready-made response. Now, that's going to be an interpersonal thing. Then there's going to be the communal thing. And again, this is why I say concreteness is going to be our friend way more than abstract things like whiteness or equity and things like this. It's much better to ask, what does this person need? What does this community need? And how can I, like the Good Samaritan, heal what is here in front of me? The Good Samaritan parable is weird because the Samaritans are the ones who are being oppressed. They are the ones who have suffered systemic injustices. But it's the Samaritan who is called to respond to the image of God, respond to the icon in his oppressor, or at least the person who belongs to the class of his oppressor. And that is the question, I think, that is going to be left for us. We either cling to the idol and we will sink, because the idols only generate more and more divisions. That's what they do. You'll start doubting whether, love between black people and white people is authentic black love. Or you'll start trying to figure out, oh, is adopting a child of another race an injustice? These are the divisions that generate and will multiply and continue to multiply as long as this thing remains in the middle of our minds, in the middle of our theology. You need to break the idol. That is the only way you deal with idols.
There's so many good questions here, so I'm trying to parse through these. Let's start with this one. The question says, are there groups that are empowering certain, are groups that are empowering certain races harmful or pulling us, are they pulling us together or pulling us apart? Do these groups enforce more division? So I think the question is, there are advocacy groups out there. Are these groups helpful or harmful? Are groups that are trying to be helpful in the action side of racial justice, are they pulling us together or are they pulling us apart? And Kevin, let's stick with you.
Sure,
I'd
yeah.
love for you to start on that.
I guess my answer would be just more or less you'd have to look at concretely what's being done. As an example, right? Historic black colleges and universities. These do exist, right, to empower a certain racial group. I don't think that they are harming. I don't think that they are hurting things. I think they're a response to certain needs in particular places where, right, that people have been discriminated against, and you want to give them a place where they can have a sort of, enjoyment of their culture, history, things like that, which is still, right, I want to say American culture, not black culture. And I think generally they do a pretty good job, right? And things like this are healthy on the whole. When they start asking you to treat people as stereotypes, then you're in trouble. Okay, because we start asking funny questions like, are you authentically black? Are you politically black? That is one of the most bizarro things I think that I've seen over the last year is, I think when Joe Biden was on a black podcast and he tells the host, well, if you're not sure who to vote for, you're not black. And here was a white guy trying to check the black card of someone, and I thought, this is what is poisonous and crazy about this situation, because we now think there's something like black ideas and black politics in a very narrow sense. Or that, to be black is to think a certain way. White people, and this is one of the few places where I'll say are privileged, you never take away someone's white card for thinking stupid stuff. So allow black people to think stupid stuff. And so it's weird, policing blackness, policing, authentic, are you authentically one of us? That's kind of crazy to me. So you have to ask yourself, what's happening here, right? Are we front-loading the idol? Are we front-loading the idea of the stereotypes, of divisions? And especially, are we trying to act in the shadow of a racial hierarchy? And that's what we need to get away from. If you can get away from that, then I think, there's plenty of these organizations that I think are good and healthy and should be supported.
Matt, this is same topic, different question, worded slightly differently. It says, do you believe or fear that much of today's rhetoric on white, black, Asian, etc. culture is only pushing us further into toxic tribalism rather than helping us unify and celebrate our cultures? Do we long for, subconsciously, a tribe to satisfy inclusion, and will that end our strive for individuality, our strive for individuality?
Who could be against unity? Right? Isn't that what we're all shooting for? I think we have to think long and hard about that. We're going to talk about unity, then we need to talk about a unity that is not the stick your fingers in your ears colorblind paradigm that has dominated the post-civil rights era conversation in the United States. Nobody cared about unity for hundreds of years as labor, as toil, as reproduction was extracted from enslaved peoples in this country. Nobody cared about colorblindness and unity when massive white affirmative action programs built the white middle class and excluded African Americans and other people of color from participating during the New Deal era. When we can start talking about the reality of that fact, when we can start reckoning with the reality of the actual history of this country, then maybe we can start talking about unity. I am highly suspicious of everybody that wants to run straight to reconciliation and unity without reckoning with why we are not unified. We talk a lot about polarization as if that's the be-all, end-all bad guy of our society. And certainly polarization is a factor. But our problem is not polarization. Our problem is racism. It's not tribalism, some kind of generic thing where everybody just likes their own group. It's white supremacy. And until we can reckon with that and meaningfully address that, playing the unity card, playing the reconciliation card will always just be a way to shut down conversation and try to maintain an unjust status quo by sticking our fingers in our ears, closing our eyes, and saying, la, 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 la. And that's hard to hear sometimes, but I think it's the reality of our situation. So to see people who are working to redress those historic injustices, accused of being people who are prompting division and tribalism and polarization, is pretty irritating. Because what those folks are offering us is a chance to tell the truth about ourselves as a society. And that's the only way that something like unity might ever be achievable. I'll pause there, I guess.
This question says, a simple question, who created skin? And then the writer goes on to
Who creates
answer it, who created skin?
skin?
And then it says, the color of skin is a creation of God, that's a gift. Why can't we see the gift and honor it and embrace it? Kevin, you can start.
Thank you.
Who created skin? That's the question.
Oh, that's the question. Oh, okay.
And why can't we honor it and see it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to go with the Sunday school answer on this, I suppose. I mean, on my Christian campus. God created skin. But, I mean, I think it's obvious that we do see it. And the problem is our reactions to it, right? No one's claiming that they don't see it. At least the racists don't, the anti-racists don't. I mean, now the reasons why we respond in an unhealthy way, that's interesting. And some of them are obviously going to be historically conditioned cultural and political reasons. And I think Matt's given a pretty good articulation of a lot of the injustices that have happened. And we can't just wish those away or act as if the consequences of those are still not with us in some way. Yeah, so I think God created skin. We do see skin. And yeah, melanin is great.
And maybe I would just add, again, when we talk about race, we need to not go straight to thinking of it as a neutral and natural demographic descriptor, right? This is more than skin color, right? Kevin mentioned the one-drop rule. In some states in the southern United States, during periods of this country's history, it didn't matter what color your skin was. A different legal framework was in place. It mattered who your parents were, who your ancestors were. That was one way of constructing race, right? At different points in this country's history, the Irish have been considered not white, right? Italians, not white. In fact, a big part of the story of whiteness is the story of its gradual expansion to include wave after wave of European immigrants that came to this country, right? So part of the thing we need to do when we hear race is not go immediately to thinking of it as simply a name to describe the amount of melanin that is in your skin, but rather a way of seeing and being in the world, right? That is flexible and adaptable and can change over time, regardless of melanin.
Matt, stay on that thought for a second. This question says, why are we focusing so much on whiteness and European centricity as if racism began in the 15th century? The problem of racism existed long before then, even long before Jesus ever walked the earth.
Again, I think we have to go back to what is race? Race is not just a generic category. It's not something that someone has always had. There have always been people, right, with different amounts of pigmentation in their skin. There has not always been race. Race does begin in the early modern world. There was when race was not. And so again, we have to be pushed to think about what do we mean when we talk about race? We are not talking about a natural and neutral demographic descriptor. We're not talking about a biological or even a phenotypical property of human beings. We are talking about an imagined construction of what it means to be human in the world that, yes, does correlate with biological or phenotypical properties, but in ways that flex and change over time. People who are considered white now did not used to be considered white. People who are considered, right, black now, those boundaries have always shifted. Whiteness is flexible and malleable. So if you take nothing else from tonight, when you think about race, when you think about whiteness, don't think of it as a natural and neutral descriptor of biological property of a person. Think of it as the social and cultural project that it is that emerges in the 15th century and following.
Do you agree with that? Yeah.
Yes, and just sort of something that might be helpful is there's a lovely collection of volumes called The Image of the Black in Western Art. And you can, as you go through, and it starts with the ancient world into, I think, fairly recently, if you look at the way black people are depicted, you notice that initially they are met, so to speak, as different, but at a kind of similar cultural or political level. And so they actually kind of look the way they look, as best as the kind of Europeans can draw, okay? But as you go through the books, you see, with the early modern period, it shifts and becomes worse and worse and worse until you get down to Sambos and things like that. And so that shows you, something happened in that initially Africans were just met, so to speak, as African, but later became black. And so to this point about social constructs, here's maybe another way of sort of drilling this point in. There's different kinds of social constructs, okay? So let's start with something mild, significantly controversial. According to some people, sex is a social construct, okay? But presumably it's a social construct that mirrors or matches onto certain orders, a certain kind of order in the world. Otherwise, the biologists would be lying when they told us about the birds and the bees, okay? Traffic lights at Hope College are a social construct. They don't belong to anything in the natural world, but they do impose an order onto the world. The US dollar is a social construct. Okay, so some social constructs seem to match things in the world. Some social constructs introduce new orders into the world. But then there's race, which introduces a disorder into the world. A disordered way of looking at people, dealing with people, treating with people, etc., 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 etc. It's a special kind of thing. I mean, there might be other destructive social constructs, obviously, but social constructs are different. They do different things. Some of them are kind of vanilla. Some of them are actually useful. Otherwise, you would not be here trying to get a degree. And some of them are destructive. And so kind of organize that in your minds.
I think we have time for one more, and so I'm going to try to combine a couple of these into one closing question. I think one thing we can all agree on is that things are not as they should be with regard to the racial climate, racial justice. What's one thing you might suggest that a student can do to make things a little bit better on our campus? And like we said at the beginning, maybe we can't solve all the world's problems, but perhaps we can solve some problems on this campus. And perhaps what we can then do is be a model for how the world can solve problems. Because we have the opportunity here to bring people together from all walks of life and live together and eat together and worship together and play together. And it strikes me that there's a remarkable opportunity in that to perhaps do something differently than the way the world is doing it. I'll toss it up and let whoever wants to go first go.
I can go.
Great.
You ready?
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Okay. One of the nice things about coming to the United States and starting to teach, et cetera, is I've gotten, not enough, but I've got into the thought of Martin Luther King Jr. And he's a complicated guy because he is leveraged on very many different sides of these debates for purposes that might be alien to his beliefs or his philosophy, et cetera. But one thing that struck me this year as I was reading Letter from Birmingham Jail, I don't know, maybe the fourth time or something, or the fifth time, he's talking about preparation for direct action, so when they sort of go out and do nonviolent protest. And he says, well, the first thing that we do is we go out and try and get the truth of what has happened. And then we negotiate, if we can, to see if we can improve our lot. Third, which was striking to me because it jumped out for the first time, even though I'd read this several times before, was self-purification. And that's one of the things I think is more or less alien to most of the discourse. There's zero kind of Christian discipline about the way people go about this. And so we need to do real things like fast and pray vigils and really purify yourself. But you can't just be doing it in the kind of, blind, plugging your ears sort of way. You also need to read the history, and you have to face it. You cannot afford to run away from it. It's painful, it's bloody, it's disgusting, it turns your stomach. It makes you ashamed to be human, might make, et cetera. But I'd say that's maybe the place to start, that you have to spiritual purification, and you have to face things, and you have to face them for what they are. And then face people for who they are. Don't face them for categories, right? So this is all kind of all together. And that's maybe, if I had one thing, that would be it.
For me, this is really simple. And this is for the students. The one thing you can do is organize. There has never yet been a major advancement of racial justice in this country that was just handed down from the top. It has always been the result of large groups of ordinary people working together to build power to force change. Right? Lincoln didn't go into the Civil War with a plan for emancipation. In the 1930s, FDR went to labor leaders and said, "We've got the New Deal. You guys have to make me do this." Same thing with LBJ and King. LBJ met with Martin Luther King in the Oval Office and said, "You guys need to go down south and raise hell, right? So that I have the political cover to make this decision." We tend to read history from the top. The New Deal, oh, that was FDR. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, oh, those were LBJ. Emancipation of the slaves, oh, that was Lincoln. It's a particular way we like to tell history in this country that doesn't work very well because it obscures the fact that behind every single one of those decisions were large groups of ordinary people who worked together to create a climate in which those decisions could be made. So I know it's risky to sit here next to President Scogin and say this, but make him do the things you want to see happen, right? Just like FDR said, you got to make him, not because he's against you, right? Because that's part of how these changes always happened. It's very rarely that you just have a messianic leader, as much as I love you. There are no messianic leaders who step fully formed into a space and bring with them an ever-flowing torrent of justice. It is always democratic change that comes from the bottom up, that is driven by ordinary people working together. And on this campus, the ordinary people are our students. Too often in higher ed today, students are taught to think of themselves simply as consumers. You pay your money, you sit back, and you receive your goods. I would encourage you to think of yourselves as active citizens, as people with a stake in the future of what happens to you, and as people who know that unless you organize and create the kind of atmosphere where change has to happen, change might happen, but it also might not. So organize.
It's good. It's really good. I appreciate it. There's one question here that's to me that I will answer quickly. It just simply says, what was the title of the book you mentioned, President Scogin, at the opening? The book is called Reading While Black. It's by Esau Macaulay, and he's coming here in November. It'll be a great event. I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, we talked at the beginning about how both Kevin and Matt have different lived experiences and different perspectives. We also talked about some of the things they have in common, both scholars, both passionate about issues of race and racial justice. One thing I didn't mention, but I think it's pretty obvious, is that both of these gentlemen are passionate followers of Jesus Christ. And that's what holds us together. And I think that at the end of the day is why we can be a community of folks who come from lots of different backgrounds and have myriad of different perspectives. And I hope some of what you've heard tonight has challenged you. I hope it's made you think. I hope you've heard some things you disagree with. That's part of being in college. That's part of being together where we learn from each other, where we understand each other. My family, we had the chance this past summer to go to Rwanda in June, and we were there for 10 days visiting some friends, and we spent about 5 days in the city of Kigali, and then we drove out to a national park and did a safari at Akagera National Park, and we rented a car and drove out. It was about a 3-hour drive, and we were about an hour into the drive, and I said, let's just turn on the radio and see what's on the radio. So I pushed the button to turn on the radio, and the radio was tuned to whatever station it was tuned to. They were singing a worship song, and I recognized the tune, but they were not singing in English. They were singing in a native Rwandan language. And it just was this incredibly moving moment for me that here we are across the world in a totally different place, totally different culture, totally different kinds of people, and yet they're worshiping the same God. He's a big God. And that's what can bring us all together, is we worship a big God, and we can come from lots of different perspectives. We can vote differently, we can think differently, but we can come together, and we can form the kind of community that God talks about, a new community centered around God. And this is what it talks about in Revelation, all nations, all tribes, all languages coming together around the throne of God. So the last thing I want to say is simply thank you to Kevin and to Matt. This took some courage, as I hope you can appreciate. This took some courage for them to come up on stage and say some provocative things, say some things that will make all of us think, and hopefully this will spur conversations for all of you tonight and tomorrow and in the weeks to come. And hopefully you can model exactly what they've done, which is disagreeing well. And we'll see, jury's still out, but I think they're going to shake hands at the end of this conversation. So thank you, Kevin, thank you, Matt, and thanks to all of you for coming.